Hello everyone, my name is William Raska, and today we're going to discuss normal and abnormal growth patterns in children. Our objectives are to review anthropometrics, we're going to describe normal growth patterns, we're going to practice evaluating growth patterns, and we're going to identify following patterns: poor and excessive weight gain, poor and excessive height gain, and changes in head circumference that are atypical. And then we're going to look at the different causes of these findings. So let's ground this. Your 14-year-old daughter brings home another 14-year-old friend to study together. The friend seems several centimeters shorter than your daughter. So look at this. There is a bit of a difference here, isn't there? The friend learns that you are a scientist and asks if she is going to grow taller. How would you respond? So I'm hoping by the end of this presentation we'll be able to respond in a meaningful way. So the first thing we do in pediatrics when we're evaluating growth is we take direct measurements, and we follow the weight very carefully. We measure length and height. Length is usually in the first 2 years of life because they can't really stand up. And we also spend a bit of time on height velocity, meaning how quickly are they changing height each year. And we also measure head circumference. The ratios we tend to use will be weight for height in children under 2, BMI in children over the age of 2, and there's this important concept of mid-parental height. So let's look at this picture of this couple over here. You have a man here and his partner here, and they have conceived this beautiful child here, and they want to know, based upon population statistics, how tall will that child be? And you could say roughly you divide the parental height percentage by 2, and you shade it a little bit more to men if the child's a boy and a little bit more to women if the child's a girl. But here's the exact formula for predicting height in children based upon population statistics. So how do we measure children anthropometrics? Essentially, we use a scale in young children. When we're measuring height, we actually have to lay them down in this contraption here because they can't stand up very easily. Once they're a little bit older, 3 years of age, at least 2 years of age, we put them in a stadiometer, which is a very accurate measurement of their height. And we spend a bit of time measuring head circumference. It can be with as simple as thing as just a tape measure here, and there are also measurement tools that you just wrap around the head, and it'll tell you the head circumference, and you just have to measure the exact same spot every single time. So it's right in this area here on the forehead and the occipital bump back here. We spend an enormous amount of time plotting this information on growth curves. Now there's a lot of information in this slide. You can see that we can measure from birth to 36 months, and we can actually measure older children, 2 to 20 years of age. We have charts for girls and we have charts for boys. And notice that we measure on the y-axis either length or weight, and we plot that as a function of age in this direction. So we can measure the weight for a young infant and say we plot it right here, and we measure another weight and we plot it right here, another weight right here, and we say, oh, the child's going around the 50th percentile. We can also measure head circumference, the same sort of thing. We measure head circumference on the y-axis and we plot age on the x-axis, and we can see where it is compared to a standard. And we can do weight for length over here to make sure the child is about the right proportion between the two of them. If we blow these curves up a little bit, we can get a little bit more information. And these are the major curves here. This is based on a population of children. So the curves we're using for the Centers for Disease Control are healthy children, primarily urban, based upon 10,000 measurements or so. There are growth curves for children with Turner syndrome. There are growth curves for children with Down syndrome. There are growth curves for children who are born prematurely. But the standard curve that we're going to use is for healthy children. So if you have a child who's, say, 36 months of age and has a weight here of 28 pounds or so, that would suggest the child is heavier than 25% of the population. And we spend a lot of time with these curves trying to figure out what the percentage is compared to a national population, but also see what the pattern is to see if any individual growth parameters crossing a line, meaning that they would start at the 5th percentile and then dive in that direction over time, or to look for asymmetry, meaning the growth is fine but the linear velocity is poor. So there's this concept of a growth channel, meaning that lots of children will be born at the 50th percentile, roughly 3.1 kilograms, but then that doesn't actually predict their adult height in any way, shape, or form. That generally between 6 and 18 months of life, children drift to their appropriate growth curve. So that around 24 months of life, children, for the most part, are on their growth channel, and you can actually predict adult height for the most part by their measurements at 24 months of life. So this is just an example. This is a child that was born at the roughly at the 50th percentile. You can see it over here, and then it's just growing along 50th percentile, and then around 9 months starts to drift, and now the growth curve is around on the 10th percentile. And you can see it's a little bit of a delay up here, but roughly around the 10th percentile for height. That's the way that child is genetically programmed to grow over time. So newborns grow pretty quickly, as you can imagine. Now, interesting enough, they do lose around 10% of their weight in the first few days of life, and that's because they have a lot of fluid, but they should definitely regain their weight by 10 to 14 days of life. And generally, our rule is that they should gain between 15 and 30 grams a day for the first 3 months of life. Look at this, they double their worth rate by 4 months, so they are growing quickly. Height velocity is similar, that they have dramatic changes in height velocity over time. Young children, look at this, they're growing 25 centimeters per year. They are just rapidly growing. But the number that we spend a lot of time looking at is this time, because this is when parents oftentimes will bring their children in, some of this school-age child, and say, is my child growing? And this is an important number. Are they growing 5 centimeters per year? And we have to have reliable data to make some inferences. So generally we like to have growth data, height velocity data, over at least 6 to 12 months with serial measurements. And if you've sustained height velocity less than 5 centimeters per year, we think, uh-oh, something may be wrong. And of course, there's very little growth potential after girls have their menses, only a couple centimeters, and we have to let parents know that. We measure BMI in the same way that adults do. This is the calculation, and we can put them on the curve. And again, we like to inform parents if their child is obese to see if we can do anything to help prevent obesity. And of course, we also look at children who are really low BMI because they're at risk for undernutrition. So we have this beautiful girl who's 15 months of age, and we look at her growth curve, and everything looks great. Her height and weight are both at the 50th percentile. Everything looks good, and we reassure the parents that there's normal growth pattern. But what if things aren't working so well? So let's talk about poor weight gain. It's also known as failure to thrive. So the definition for failure to thrive is a little ambiguous. It could be weight for age that falls below the 5th percentile on multiple occasions, or it's a deceleration that crosses two major percentiles on our growth curve. So let's look at this chart over here. And this turns out to be a child with celiac disease, an autoimmune disease of the gut. But you can see the child is growing here and doing around 50th percentile for the growth, and right around 6 months of age, the growth, the just not gaining weight at all, and really goes well beneath for the 5th percentile here. So this be crossing 2% and two major percentiles beneath the 5th percentile meets criteria for failure to thrive. There's a lot of other information on this slide. Notice that the height velocity is relatively preserved compared to the weight velocity. And that's because the body really tries to maintain height velocity in the when there aren't enough calories. So the preference is you have to maintain head circumference growth. The second thing that you'll try to preserve is your height velocity. And again, the thing that you'll fall off first when you don't have enough calories for whatever reason is that you will lose weight. And then again, you change the diet. This is again, patient with celiac disease, change the diet. The weight comes up very nicely here. So when we talk about poor weight gain or failure to thrive, the first thing we always do is talk about caloric intake. That's probably the most common reason for children to have failure to thrive, and we spend a bit of time talking about breastfeeding. Are the breasts engorged? Is the milk in? Are they mixing the formula correctly? How many bottles a day the child is taking? But we also have to think about inadequate absorption. So we saw on the previous slide, child with celiac disease wasn't absorbing things. And then, of course, there's increased metabolism, such as cystic fibrosis or even congestive heart failure, where children need more calories to grow. There's also excessive weight, obesity, and again, this is just similar to the way in adults. The most common cause is increased intake of calories. We have a lot of problems in children because they're sitting in front of TVs too much or other social media or video games. And when they're doing that, they tend to actually eat more. They're not expending enough energy and they tend to eat more. And so this is a BMI curve of a boy who's maintained at the 95th percentile for a long time. There are other reasons for hypothyroidism, but increased number of calories is by far the way most common in children. Now we're going to switch to short stature. The child doesn't seem as tall as the child should be. And this is a little different. We're not talking so much about calories, but we have a different type of history. We want to know when the parents underwent their growth spurts. We want to know when the mother had her first period. We want to know the height of the parents. We're going to look for different signs and symptoms suggest a cause for the decreased height. And we're going to measure the growth curve just like we did for weight. But we also have this new concept of a bone age. We can measure how old the body thinks it is. So this is a bone age. All we do is we take a film of the hand and the wrist and we compare it to normals because we know that there's a normal progression of epiphyseal calcification. We just compare it to standards and we can predict how old the bones think the child is. So classically, if a child was 14 years of age and you did an x-ray of the wrist, you would be able to compare it to a 14-year-old and say they were very, very similar. But some people, particularly those who have constitutional growth delay, a 14-year-old child will have the bones that appear to be that of a 12-year-old child. And that isn't pathologic. We just say there's a bit of a delay and that child has 2 years of growth more than you'd expect by their chronologic age. So what are the causes of short stature? It can just be a variant of normal. The child has short parents. It could be something called constitutional delay. And then there's some chromosomal abnormalities such as Turner syndrome and Down syndrome, and illnesses such as hypothyroidism or growth hormone deficiency or chronic illnesses. So this is a growth curve of a child with genetic or familial short stature. And you can see it just continues to plot along right here. This is the height velocity. It's still 5 centimeters per year. It happens to be below the 5th percentile, but nonetheless, it's growing correctly. And this is the target height based upon mid-parental height. So you can say this child has normal growth. And this is just the same pattern, but in a boy. This is a little bit different. This is constitutional delay, in that you have the height velocity coming along here. It starts to drift a little bit, particularly in the prepubertal area, and then a little bit later than the peers, it picks up, crosses the curves normally, and now hits the target height. This is a child with constitutional delay, not genetic short stature. So let's compare familial short stature or genetic short stature to constitutional delay. So let's examine these two individuals at age 13, which actually turns out to be right around this age and right around here or so, and see what we can conclude. We can see that they're both somewhat short compared to the general population. But if you were to do to bone age on the person with familial short stature would not be delayed, where it would be delayed in constitutional delay. The growth rate is normal. The growth rate in constitutional delay is generally normal, maybe just slightly lower compared to the population. And the height prognosis is poor, basically the genetic programming, whereas this child is going to catch up and hit the target height just a little bit later than his or her peers. There are other causes for short stature, including hypothyroidism. This is something we're always watching out for, whether it's congenital, though we don't see that very often because of our neonatal screening program. We see it more often in acquired. And realistically, the height just stops. The child just does not grow any height, though they may continue to gain weight. And again, that's easily diagnosed based upon history and some laboratory testing. And this is such a classic growth curve. And very fortunately, we can recognize these signs and symptoms here. And if we find out the cause, we can and recognize that we can actually give replacement, and these children grow very nicely. Growth hormone is very unusual. You're not going to see this very much in the clerkship, but just so you know, if you don't have any growth hormone, you're just not going to grow, and you're going to have a lot of other problems. There are genetic syndromes associated with short stature. Two of the more famous ones that we want to talk about in the clerkship are Turner syndrome and trisomy 21. And again, this is where you'd have a predicted height up around the 5th percentile, and you have a person tracking at the left less than the 5th percentile. Turner syndrome is a genetic syndrome. It's XO. You have 45 chromosomes, and the findings include short stature, we've discussed, but lymphedema. And here's a picture of a child with lymphedema, the swollen hands and feet, the broad chest and widely spaced nipples, the low posterior hairline, and a webbed neck. And you can see a picture of this webbing here that would be suggestive of someone who might have Turner syndrome. Tall stature is actually most commonly familial. Just the father 6'8" and the mother 6 foot, and children are destined to be pretty tall. And you can see that on this curve over here. The targeted height is way up here, or greater than 95th percentile, and that's where the child is tracking, and that'd be pretty normal. Endocrine, you have precocious puberty, but more commonly we're going to see in pediatrics just early puberty, which is sort of a mixed finding. And then you have some genetic syndromes such as Klinefelter and Marfan's. And again, this is a school picture, clearly someone taller than the rest of the population. This is where we start worrying, is when a child has a targeted height right around here, but is up there. We're going to say, is something amiss? So early puberty is sort of interesting, and it's a sort of a mixed finding where they're too tall and then a little short. And if you look at the curve here, they're going through puberty earlier than their peers, and that's associated with a growth spurt, as we saw on the previous curves. And so they're taller than their peers earlier on. Now they've had their menses, or they've gone through puberty, and now they don't have much growth curve left, so they wind up being shorter than their peers. So here, they're taller than their peers, but eventually they wind up being a little bit shorter than their peers. Klinefelter is XXY. You have 47 chromosomes. You may have one or more extra X chromosomes, and there are several findings that are associated with it. That you have fewer chest hairs. The boys tend to have more breast development, small testicular size, and they tend to have long arms and legs and narrow shoulders. But they are quite tall for their population. Marfan syndrome is associated with mutations in the FBN1 gene, which encodes fibrillin, and that's a component of the extracellular matrix. And this is a photograph of a child with Marfan. They tend to be tall and slender, but classically they have very long extremities, and they have a long width, this if they're extended their arms, compared to their height. They may have a pectus, long skinny fingers, dilation of the aorta, thin wrists, and a variety of other findings. The final topic will be head circumference, and this has been really big because of Zika virus around the world, and microcephaly means small head. And again, these are pictures from the CDC showing the extent of microcephaly and severe microcephaly. And we worry about children with microcephaly because we worry that it could be an insult to parenchymal tissue and may have implications to normal development. Now, you can have a small head, you have familial small heads, but again, when it's different from the rest of the family, then you'd be more concerned that this could lead to some developmental problems. And the final topic will be head circumference, meaning large heads, and with large heads, macrocephaly. This again can be familial, that everyone in the family has large heads, but we worry about it when it has this type of pattern where the head circumference is clearly on an upward trajectory and the weight and height are not, and we worry there may be obstruction or ventricular megaly. And again, we worry about developmental outcomes and whether or not there's a drainage problem that needs to be addressed. So I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, you're going to feel a bit more comfortable answering these questions, and we look forward to seeing you during the application session.